Hi everyone, and welcome to a new series of modelling vlogs. I'm Colin Lee. I'm a narrow gauge modeller in 009 mostly, but these ideas and tips and tricks I'm going to be showing you are relevant to all scales, all the way up to garden railways and down to the very, very tiny scales as well. So I've been asked by the 009 Society South Wales group to give an initial idea about how to do etched brass soldering. Now, this is something which a lot of people are kind of scared, frightened about, and probably way back in time before I started on this, I would have been in that camp too. So what I'm going to do is show you lots of little ideas and tips and tricks which can make it a lot easier. And ultimately, it's a really easy thing to do, and it isn't much different to plastic kits that you might well have done. So I've built about 90-ish etched brass coaches and loco kits. So I've made lots of mistakes along the way. I can explain some of those and hopefully avoid you making the same mistakes. But one of the things I definitely learned is that there are very few mistakes that are completely terminal. In most cases you can start again. Ultimately you can go off and buy another kit and try again. And if you start with something that's quite cheap, you know, that's not a big issue. So I'm going to be using some Worsley Works etched brass kits. These are probably 15, 20, 25 pounds. Okay, so if you want to copy me and go for one of these soldering stations with different temperatures along the side, then this is an Aton 938D at 60 watts, which will do pretty much everything up to the very large etched brass pieces. Perhaps for the very biggest kind of garden rail it might not quite have enough oomph, but it's got most of it, and it's got buttons on the front which can basically change the temperature of the tip. I tend to use between 300 and 400 degrees C. Now I don't actually know if that's the temperature of the tip, but that's the calibration they use on this. I tend to start with 400, but I'll find over time sometimes particularly the 145 solder can get a little bit liquidy with that, so and hard to use, so I sometimes dial it down to the 300. For the white metal soldering, and you can use the lower settings on this, and we'll get to that in a separate video. It comes with its own kind of integral stand. It's quite good because it has a connector here that you can just very simply take it apart when you want to store it, etc. We've got the classic sponge, which is great kind of between bits of soldering, but won't get all the excess solder off. In fact, there's a little bit on the tip there. So I've used a bit of wire wool in a spaghetti, one of those half spaghetti cans. Nice little tip I read somewhere in a modelling magazine, and you can really get in there and get the tip clean using that. And I find it useful. You can also buy separate kind of pieces which have the same effect, but that's a cheap way of doing it. And finally, I would also just mention start of every session, or if I'm struggling with the tip later on in a big session, which isn't very often, I'd use a tip cleaner piece here. This is from Multicore, from Henkel, and it's very clever little magical stuff that you just pop your heated soldering iron into on the tip, and it will clean it and also provide like a kind of coating which allows the heat to get through the kind of, I guess, the oxidation or the old solder, etc. Final piece I use for the main kind of soldering piece is this. It's a smoke absorber. This is an FA400. It plugs into the mains. Little switch at the back. It's not too bad. I'll see if we can hear the noise on this. It's all right. It's probably a bit annoying every now and again, so you can turn it off and on quite easily, but that will draw the smoke away from your lungs and into the filter in there, which is a good thing, particularly if you're doing lots of soldering. But otherwise, just try and find as well ventilated an area as possible, and don't breathe in the smoke and the fumes that come off probably not very good for you, and when something like that plus a bit of ventilation is a good thing. The kind of crucial things for soldering are cleanliness, so ensuring that the brass that you are cleaning, you're soldering, is cleaned, and I'll show you some tools for that in a second. Making sure that the soldering iron is in a good state and at the right temperature, so that cleanliness. The second thing is a flux, which allows the solder to flow. So I use Barry Stevenson's acid liquid flux. This comes from Slater's, and it's 9% phosphoric acid. And I basically use an old paintbrush, a manky one that I've probably used too much in actual painting, and I just want to basically see out the end of its life. The acid will effectively attack it, and in time the bristles, as has actually happened with this one, there isn't a lot left there, will die. So you'll have to chuck it and then use another. But it's by far the easiest way to literally paint a seam of phosphoric acid flux on. Okay, so let's talk about the main tools you'll need. You'll definitely need some of these. These are tin snips. These are specialist ones from DCC Concepts, which are fabulous and extremely sharp and quite long as well, so you can really get in and chop. They are excellent. There are other Xeron ones which have slightly shorter, well, quite a lot shorter actually, about 50% of that. Jaws, which are also good, but I mean, I've found these to be fantastic. You'll need some long nose pliers. Make sure you get ones which don't have serrated insides to the jaws there, otherwise you'll make marks on the etched brass. They're very, very useful to get in and bend things, that kind of thing. I also though use a thing called a hold and fold. Now you absolutely don't need one of these, but they are very, very good. And this has various different kind of holding pieces that you can unscrew these, pop your brass in, get it exactly where you want to fold it, do up the little thumb wheels, and then fold it beautifully using this very, very sharp edge on the end to get a perfect 90-degree bend. And it's particularly useful for things which are a very long fold. So you may well be able to fold a short fold to 90 degrees with something like that, but if you want to get it perfect along a long edge, which you might be doing on, say, a footboard or something like that, then they do use the hold and fold, and that's well worth the investment. I think it was about 20-30 quid, so it's something you only want to buy if you're doing a lot of it, but it is brilliant. I also use a classic hand drill. This is a bit of a beast. I think I got it from Squires. It's got a very easy hand chuck, and you can very easily go from large to small like that. So I find that to be extremely really useful, and a set of decent drills. Do spend some money on the drills, because you can get some real cheap rubbish that will just break all the time. Do go for some good ones, and you'll find there are certain sizes you keep coming back to, particularly the hole for a 10BA screw or bolt, and I think actually that's what this one exactly here is. So you can get in and screw quite quickly. A whole series of files, kind of hand needle files like this. You can get sets from modelling shops pretty cheaply. Also find the kind of nail files that you get from Boots and places like that can be useful as well. And then if you really want to get into it, then these FlexiFile flex pads, which come in various different types, and you can also get these long sticks as well, can in certain circumstances be useful. But actually, if you've got a set of decent needle files with different shapes, you'll find probably that the one which is kind of rectangular is probably the most useful, alongside the very, very thin needle that you can get into holes. I can't think of the word for the second. Will be the most useful. You'll also need a fiberglass brush. Brilliant, but also annoying. Make sure you blow away or brush away, and perhaps use something like a makeup brush, a soft brush to blow stuff away. Very, very easy, because otherwise the little fiberglass pieces get into your fingers, and they are the devil to get out, because you have to carefully find it and take some tweezers to get them out, but also incredibly painful. So be aware of that, but brilliant for cleaning up etched brass. You can also get bigger ones, bigger diameter versions and other versions. I've got several here that you can just use amongst things. I sometimes use a brass fibered brush. Doesn't tend to be that useful, but sometimes they tend to be a bit harsh and scratch. And what you don't want, particularly on, say, the panelling of a coach, is to scratch it. You just want to polish it and take the layer of I guess it's like an oxidation on the brass. Sorry if that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. We've also got, and this is a really useful tool, this is like a little chisel. Hopefully you can see that there. And that's really useful at just getting rid of excess solder that might have got in places you didn't mean. Very, very useful. You can use a screwdriver for that, but you just got to be really careful you don't scratch it. So honing this carefully is well worth doing. You might find an old needle file you could perhaps polish up on something like a lathe or a sanding stone, but you can also buy them as well. And then we've got, for making holes the right size, you've obviously usually would use a drill, but sometimes if you find that hole is very, very close to an edge, or if you only want to take a tiny extra amount out of the hole, then you'd use a bunch of different tools. Now, I've got both a reamer here, which starts technically at 0mm, but it's slightly above that, all the way up to 14mm, and you'll put that into the hole and twist it to get the right amount. But I've also got a set here of various different sizes down to tiny little, if I show you that there, you'll see these are little reamers which you can put into a drill chuck and you can use. Now, getting the right size is always a bit of a trial and error job, but they're quite useful. I tend to use that reamer that goes from 0 to 14 a lot more because it's just easier. It depends on what you're doing. Sharp knives, obviously. I have both a very, very sharp scalpel type and also a bit more chunky beast to get through certain tabs or anything like that. And then you'll need a straight edge for the kind of folding, particularly if you haven't got the hold and fold. A set square, and this is a bit of a chunky one which I can use on its end as I solder something up to it, or that kind of thing. One of the things you'll find you'll need a lot is extra hands. You've only got two. One's probably holding the soldering iron and the other might get hot. So one little tip I've got for you is to get a little bit of cork underlay. This is the kind of stuff you use just to put under track on a layout. This doesn't conduct heat to any degree, so if you're soldering something which is brass, you can literally hold it the other side and take a bit of grass here, and you won't get the heat through to your fingers. And then there is a very specialist tool. So this is a 90-degree clamp. It's got tiny little thumb wheels that you can do up either side, and this is really useful for carriages or 90-degree bends where you've got two pieces of etched brass. You pop them in there, you use these tiny wheels just to get it exactly perfect, and then it's clamped, and then you can run your flux in and solder away, unclamp it again, and it's brilliant. If you try and estimate that yourself, you will get it wrong, and you'll probably have to unsolder it and resolder it about 20 times. I used to do it with a little piece of 2x1 wood which I'd got exactly square. That can work as well, but this is the gold standard. Unfortunately, I cannot remember where I got it from, but I would imagine somewhere like Eileen's Emporium or Squires or one of the big tool places would have them, and they're very, very clever. And then of course we had the old brush for the flux, and obviously the soldering iron itself. They're the main tools. Okay, so we've gone into close-up here so that I can show you a few of the other tools and pieces you may well need, and I'll use this screwdriver to kind of show you. So first of all, these here are 10BA nuts, some washers in there too, and these are 10BA machine screws. Some have cheese head, you can see a kind of thicker head there, and some have countersunk there. I use various for various points, but these we often use with the nuts to either attach floors or attach in particular bogies to it. Just as an aside, whilst I'm here, I may as well show you these O-rings can be really useful for kind of suspension, if you like, of bogies. Just put them between the nut and the screw. I've also got various other sizes, loads of different types of washers that I tend to use, and a spare bin of random kind of screws and bits. But the thing I do want to show you whilst I'm here are taps and dies. So this is a tap. You will often find that when you put a captive nut onto a piece of etched brass, that you will undoubtedly get a little bit of solder into the thread. Some people put oil inside to prevent that, and there are a couple of other methods as well, but frankly I just find that if you run this tap through it afterwards, it will just clean out the solder and leave you with a really decent thread. Equally, if you've got the opposite problem, which is you've got a screw and somehow it's got paint or solder in it and therefore you're really struggling to do up the nut, then you can use a die, and this is a 10BA die which you just pop onto the screw and rotate, and it will cut a new screw thread in it. A couple of other little things that might be useful and it's worth coming in. Firstly, a kind of dental pick, which you can use to kind of pick away bits of old solder or that kind of thing. Be careful, of course, not to scratch, but you can just pick that away, and that's quite a useful tool. I think this one's from, it's from Boots. Yeah, there we go, from Boots, randomly. These reverse acting tweezers are very, very useful, and how I use these, if I come into here, I can actually get a nut. Let's just grab, I've actually got two there, which is quite annoying, but anyway, let's just get one. You can use the drawers, and you see I'm not putting any pressure now on the wooden bit there. You can use the drawers to trap the nut in, so then if you're going to go and screw it on, you can literally pop it on the top and rotate it to get it started, and I tend to find that little trick works really well. You can also use it to hold things that you want to solder. So imagine I was soldering this, I could just use this, and because of course these are wooden, you won't get the heat coming through to yourself. Now I've picked this up and I'll just explain to you what this is. This is the Bill Bedford handrail bending jig. You'll see lots of holes in there. You can pop a piece of wire in there, and you can then replicate the same distance for various handrails if you've got similar ones. Imagine down the side of a coach or something, you might have 6 or 7 handrails all the same length. You can, once you've found the right length in this jig, it's very, very easy then to replicate that. I've also got a nut spinner, or nut driver they're sometimes called. If I turn it this way up, you can hopefully see, if I get it into tap there, to get it into focus. That basically will take a nut. I've got to get used to this phone and YouTube thing. So you'll basically pop that into the nut, and then you can twist it, and it will tighten it up. That's quite a useful thing. And if you are struggling sometimes with a little mini screwdriver, I've got a little set here, getting that screw in place, because perhaps you're screwing it into a captive nut, i.e. one that's been soldered in place on the brass, then a really nice little tip given me by David Waller of Bron Hebog fame is tacky wax. So this is weird kind of waxy stuff that you can put on the end of your screwdriver. I don't know. And then if you went to get a screw, it would basically stick on the end of that. Very clever idea, and for a couple of quid it will save you a lot of messing about when you're trying to screw things in. And then finally, the other thing I mentioned a minute ago was that you need more than 2 hands with things, and so I have a little box here of various clips. These kinds of clips, these tiny little ones, are good for attaching couplings to bogies or things like that. I've got wooden ones which obviously you can then touch because they won't get hot, and I've got these flat pieces as well, which I need an assistant to do the focusing for me. As you see there, you can then use to attach 2 bits of etched brass and keep them clamped together. I've also played about with these little hair clips. I haven't found them terribly useful so far, but you never know. They're in there for future, and the classic bit of cork which I mentioned earlier. Lovely, so we're almost ready to start on the actual etched brass. So in the future, I'm going to show you how I will put together these. These are Worsley Works Vale of Rydal saloons, the modern ones that you'll see running on the railway at the moment. And you can see the consistent parts. We've got some long sides here. We've got the ends. We've got this piece here with a hole, which will be a captive nut to keep the floor and the to effectively attach the body to the floor. We've got some long pieces here which we'll use the hold and fold for, which are elements of the chassis. We've also got some specialist doors and windows and some little hinges in there as well. And I'll also show you how, because I've got some other kits which are kind of half built. So this is a Festiniog saloon, a super saloon, or super barns as they're called, which I've already cut out of its frets, and I'll be showing how we use the tabs to attach various pieces, how we fold up things like this long piece here, which retains the side and stops the side from bending, how we will get the 90-degree bend between the sides and the ends, and indeed how we'll do the roof, of which I've got a bare piece of brass there ready for that, and also some plastigard for the end. Okay, so the last thing we need to talk about is different types of solder. Now, you will see if you go to one of the shops like Eileen's Emporium and places like that, a whole host of different types of solder. In reality, all we really need is 145-degree solder. That is the kind of bog standard, do anything etched brass kind of solder. And I have lots of it. I have this barrel of it because I use so much of it. But there are lots of others, and I think it's just worth explaining what they are. So there are some higher melting point solders. So this is 188, CARS 188, and some people will use that first. Obviously its melting point is 188, so it takes a bit more heat to melt it. So if you've got lots of individual components near each other on a piece of brass or on a body or something, and you might choose to use a mix of 145 and 188 to try and avoid things becoming unsoldered as you're doing things. Now, it means a lot of planning ahead. Sometimes the instructions will suggest doing that. Okay, it's fine. I rarely use it, honestly. In fact, this is I've had for years, and you can see I hardly touched it. So don't really know if it's that useful. It certainly hasn't been for me and what I do, but some people will swear by mixing and matching different solders. And each their own, fair enough. The other types of solder you'll be aware of, and probably the one you've come across most, is the multi-core soldering wire that you would use for electronics. So your layout wiring, that kind of thing. And that tends to have a multi-core and sometimes has flux within it as well. Tends to smoke a bit more, a bit stinky as well. Definitely use the smoke absorber when we use this. And you need a totally different type of flux. So I've got a flux paste that my dad gave me. It's called Fluxite. And that's actually very, very good at making a connection, but it leaves a kind of manky residue on it, which I don't particularly like and needs a bit of cleaning. So you only need a tiny amount of the actual paste. So I've been experimenting with this, which is a flux pen, which comes from electronics basically, and you can very carefully put a small amount of flux where you actually need it and not where you don't, and therefore doesn't really need cleaning up. It's okay, seems to work all right, works quite well in electronic type situations. For layout wiring, still feel the paste is better, but we're trying it and we'll see where we go with that. And then the other piece of, and unfortunately I've only got it in a box, it's not that helpful, but is low melt solder. So this tends to be, so we talked about 188, 145 being the kidder, Below that, so probably in the region of about 100, you have what's called low melt. And that is for white metal kits basically, and you can, if once you get capable with it, you can use it to actually kind of fill holes in the white metal castings as much, but you've got to be very, very careful with the temperature, hence why needing a temperature controlled iron. And otherwise you effectively melt the white metal, because the white metal itself, its own melting point is similar, so you've got to get below that, so you're melting the low melt solder and not the white metal, and be quick with it. Can actually use the same flux that I use, the Barry Stevenson 9% phosphoric acid flux on that. Some people use different fluxes, never seen the point, to be honest. It seems to work just as well, but that's what that's for. And you will find, of course, that you couldn't possibly use 145 with white metal applications, because the melting point of this is too high. But back to etched brass, which is what this is really about. 145 is your kidder, and if you only buy some 145, you'll be fine. That's all you'll really need. There are other things you can use called solder paint. There are also these kind of solder creams that come in these syringes, and you just kind of put them in. They can be useful where you kind of want to put imagine you're kind of trying to solder two pieces of brass on top of each other, or a detail where you want to solder it on. And you might use something called a resistance soldering kit for that. And those kinds of creams and paints are useful in that situation. To be honest, certainly in the scale I use, I just use super glue. So I have a resistance soldering kit as it happens, but I hardly ever use it. And it's far easier just to use super glue, like your kind of deluxe type thing. Final thoughts on tools. There are several other things that you might well find useful during building kits like this, or building any kind of kit, it might be etched brass or not. A micrometer, this one's digital and can very quickly measure distances for you. You might find that easy, so you work out what drill size you need in a hole, or just generally because you want to measure some brass for a roof or anything like that. Lots of opportunity to use it. Don't have to, can just use a ruler, but it does certainly help. There are other types of cutters. I've got some heavy duty wire cutters which can get through solid, brass rod and that kind of thing. You don't need to. You could use a small razor saw as well. It's kind of personal preference and whether you want to invest in those kind of things along the way. I also have a set of screwdrivers and a set of these filing pads, which I did mention earlier. Again, you could probably do with one screwdriver that you might even find out of a Christmas cracker or something. They'll probably actually be good enough. You could well find one file would be fine, and if I was going for any one file, then I would use a number 2, a second cut, that is, a proper decent file from somewhere like Squires and that kind of thing. Make sure you get a handle, because otherwise they come with these kind of sharp ends, and you can imagine what damage that would do if you got your hand or your forearm in the wrong place. But second cut is broadly it. There's 3 different types of file, just so broadly, for modelers. There's polish, which you'll find is beautiful to get the final finish on something. Isn't strictly that necessary ever. The second, which does most jobs, and then there is the hilariously named bastard file, is the actual name, which is a real bastard and will really take a lot of material off, but leave quite an impact to the metal, and you'll want to polish it with a second or ultimately a polished file as well. So those. Now, I've gone through a lot of tools, and I might have frightened you by how many tools I've got here, and of course they're all useful, but you don't really need half of them. If you're just starting out, what you need is a good iron. Spend the money on the iron. That's definitely got to be where you're at. Go for a trusted make, look for reviews online, look at what other modelers use, or the forum, that kind of thing. My Atten 938D has been brilliant for many, many years, so I could certainly recommend that. I had just a normal Antex soldering iron before that. I still got it in the drawer as a backup, and it's fine. but I wanted the temperature control because I'm doing different, low melt and 145. So spend the money on the iron, a small set of needle files, a good quality knife. I would spend money on the tin snips. I think those DCC Concepts ones that I showed you are going to be really helpful for getting the pieces out of the etch. Good steel rule, and obviously the flux and the solder you need, so get your Barry Stevenson's 9% phosphoric and get your 145. And really that's kind of it. Final thing I would say is somewhere to solder on. Now I'm kind of lucky here that I've got this, it's kind of like a writing bureau with a wooden desk that folds down, which means I can store all my tools away quite simply, and I've got a wooden base to work on. Wood is obviously good because it doesn't conduct heat that well. I also use a piece of sheet glass, get that from a glazier or just randomly. I think actually IKEA sell them and stuff as well, which you can use, or even a piece of mirror glass, just something that's nice and flat so that when you are soldering stuff, you know that what you're soldering on is flat. I wouldn't obviously use these kind of cutting mats that you use in plastic modelling because they'll melt, and they definitely do melt, and they stink when they do as well, so not a good thing. But something wooden, like a breadboard even, I think I started with one of those, or a piece of glass or mirror glass, would be very worthwhile having. And then it is all about cleanliness, having the right flux and the right solder, and planning ahead. So don't get the soldering iron out in your hand and then be faffing about trying to work out how to join two pieces. It'll go wrong. But plan it through carefully, methodically and sensibly. And I would suggest getting yourself a bit of scrap brass, or just buying a sheet of brass and cutting out different bits, and just practice popping one piece on top of the other and soldering it on, which is what we'll do in the next one of these episodes. And practice using the cork to hold it, or using a set square to hold it at 90 degrees and soldering that on. Practice using different methods just to get used to it on something that doesn't matter, or a kit that you buy frankly just to scrap, and you can solder and take apart and solder and take apart as much as you want. And do remember, of course, that when you solder something, you can unsolder things usually quite easily. There are some exceptions to that, very, very long pieces where you've had to put a lot of solder on over a long distance. It's kind of harder to unsolder and you have a lot of cleaning up to do. But most things you can try again. What's the worst that can happen, as Dr. Pepper would say. There we go. So there's a quick intro into the kinds of tools I use, and the next one of these will be talking about actually doing the soldering. So do like and subscribe, and we'll see you at the next edition, which should only be a week away. Thank you.